My name is Joseph Nally, and my secret passion, or at least thesis, was on post-elegance, or the experimental aesthetics in tabletop game design, or what I like to call beyond an efficient interface for the design research writing and criticism program at SVA. So right here, I am a tabletop gamer and collector, and as you can see from this animated GIF I made, these are games that I have collected. I started this work to address my principal concern about the design of these games that I love so much, that I believe the same models of behavior that operate in the real world have the same consequences engaged in these types of board games. In other words, board games or tabletop game design present in the designer's way actually that are becoming lackluster designs. So what I mean is this approach to game design reflects something about how we view our own agency in life, how we create art, and so forth. And let me elaborate that further with the beginning of this type of game design. So here we have an early prototype for the board game Cosmic Encounter in the early 70s, designed by Peter Lotka, Bill Eberly, Jack Ketteridge, and Bill Norton. Made in the early 70s, this game had features unlike anything else that was available during that time. Players took on the role of aliens, each with three-dimensional like pieces, which was largely superfluous to gameplay. However, players can break those rules of the game, and every encounter was random between opponents. Cosmic Encounter was never a popular game, yet with all its flaws, it offered something that 1970s counterculture valued. And I believe these are individual agency or avant-garde aesthetics and experimental play. The spirit of play was not about following the rules, but understanding and subverting them in order to find new, real possibilities. So now, when I think of tabletop games that speak to me personally, I think of something that is strange. And strange is something unique and mind-bending. But importantly, I think games are more psychedelic and rainbow, like a Peter Max painting or Ben and Jerry's ice cream or washed out Polaroid pictures. The psychedelic is a mind-bending experience that asks you to experience the world with the spirit of fantasy and play. It asks for your willingness to be transformed, to be open to an end result that you can't determine or even perhaps imagine. So these traits of the psychedelic, what I value first is the experimental, which is over the conventional rulemaking and rule following. And as an example, it is like Andy Looney's Pyramid Arcade, formerly known as Ice House Pyramids. This is rather a compilation that is like a box of toys where players can experiment with making different rules. Second, the psychedelic alludes to the eccentric in both behavior and theme. As an example of eccentric would be UGTech, this board game where you actually use inflatable clubs while pretending to be a caveman, talking to each other and grunting like a caveman in order to get the right building constructions together as a team. This theme is unlike anything that is in common in traditional board games. Finally, I think the psychedelic values the modular as the form invites itself to invention. Modular can be best described as modules for the basis of design and construction. That is to say, new rules or expansions that increases the playing field and game language between the players. Rules are not something we learn and execute, but ever expanding in the field of play. As shown in this example, this is Don Bucula, who is one of the pioneers of modular synthesizers, and I also believe is a pioneer of psychedelia. So last year at Cal State University, a synth engineer got high after touching an old LSD late-coated Bucula synthesizer. The only way that this LSD was coated on there was in Bucula himself, as this was internal in the machine and wasn't open synths. This means that the operator can control the synth while getting high. This is what it means to be under a psychedelic influence, and perfectly represents this with the older Bucula models of the 1960s. Together with the experimental, eccentric, and modular make up the term post-elegance in the context of tabletop game design. Post-elegance, a term I have made up to critique the Dieter Rams-oriented form of play or style known as elegance that I believe has ruled over the tabletop industry for about 3 decades. This became central to my thesis about the future of tabletop game design and where the designer can have control over the medium again through things like post-elegance. So how would I describe something that is elegant? I think would best described as the game as Settlers of Catan, pictured here, where the player makes few choices as possible while it's simple in design and construction. However, here's what I would call something as the post-elegant. As mentioned before, I believe something as post-elegant could be things like Cosmic Wimp Out, Pyramid Arcade, a la carte, and UgTech, as these have the experimental, eccentric, and modular with them. Post-elegance, as I claim, may be the way forward for true and innovation tabletop game design. So I will go over now the 4 case studies I wrote about this. For the first one, I wrote a brief history of tabletop games and game studies, a mechanical approach, where, you guessed it, is based upon a history of design through gameplay mechanics, then of theme. This is how designers have been thinking about tabletop game design and where we are today. Then I wrote about aesthetics in tabletop game design. I use my own terminology to describe these aesthetics. They can be best described as elegance, post-elegance, narrative building, process solving, and the hybrid. These are my own terminologies. The majority of tabletop games can fall in either of these categories. Importantly, why these definitions matter and how they can envision something greater in the medium. Next, I talk about the consumption of tabletops games. This is where I conduct primary research on the topic, where I interviewed consumers at game stores and the managers, and as well as some others, and attending myself. And finally, I discussed the future of tabletop design. Importantly, my own criticism with critical theory of the Eurogame genre, which I believe is supplying this kind of elegance, is with my own categorization of process solving and narrative building, which I believe is often controlling the players, then giving this free form of post-elegance that people need in the avant-garde, especially in tabletop game design. Going over the primary research, I have interviewed 9 to 10 consumers, 3 managers, and 4 experts. Attending game nights at the Uncommons in Washington Square Park and Hex & Co. near Columbia. I played new games and made new friends and made observations about these scenes, as well as some stores in Pennsylvania from the Complete Strategist and the Games Keep in Westchester. In addition to these consumer insights, I had the pleasure of speaking with a number of gaming experts, designers and critics like Wolfgang Kramer, Keith Bergen, Peter Olatka, and Andy Looney. Now, I should reflect upon the research I have underwent and what I learned from this investigation back to my thesis. So why does this matter? So this kind of drastically changed since its inception of August of 2019. The most critical change is that my research debunked much of my own elitism on the topic. By listening to other players or consumers, I developed a deeper sense of the individual's complex relationship to tabletop games and the culture itself. Players find ways of expressing and subverting the rules in their own unique personal taste. That is, players are looking for something that is new and unique rather than the formative style of elegant play. Most surprisingly, I learned that in gaming, and maybe in life as a metaphor, some people enjoy being controlled. So as games model absurd forms of this control, game players have their pick of where pleasure is from. Yet, what can game designers take away from this critique I present? Can they be encouraged to design a post-elegant point of view, one that values, as I said, the experimental, eccentric, and modular? As new games are introduced on the market, can design writers apply these characteristics to this critique, asking whether they're encouraging users in form of rigid control or allowing for a more expansive set of possibilities in this new design field? This correlates to my previous project, Ludism, which was a catalog of noticing these types of games. And I decided to set out with a taxonomy and clarity purpose to describe what was really going on in the scene of tabletop games and the rich history. Now, eventually, I would like to create my own games and experiences similar to this taxonomy I've created. And so this thesis is a contribution to the continuing efforts of describing the abnormal and redefining the unexplained. And I wish games become more after the trend of elegance and into what I would briefly call, like of postmodernism, into the post-elegance. And I thank everyone for listening.